Chapter 3. The Guest. Miles studied the watercolour painting hanging over the small French gilt writing desk set between the parlour windows that fronted the street. It was an amateur painting. The colour opacity and the too symmetrical composition shouted amateur status. Nonetheless, the painting pleased the eye, for the unknown artist possessed a nice sense of light and a clean colour sense. Its simple, pastoral composition also stood in its favour. Curious, he leaned over the desk to read the tiny, faint signature inscribed in the bottom right corner. The size and spideriness of the signature could indicate the unknown artist's dissatisfaction or embarrassment with their work. He quickly identified Hallowell as the last name. He braced his knuckles against the gleaming desk surface as he peered closer. "Anne!" he triumphantly read aloud. "I beg your pardon?" Miles turned around. In the open parlour doorway stood two very different women. The shorter had the much-revered china doll prettiness of blonde hair, blue eyes, and fair, unblemished skin. Her expression was one of open curiosity. A tiny smile curved her perfect, bow-shaped pink lips upwards. If this was Miss Hallowell, they would account Redinger a fortunate fellow to capture this beautiful morsel. However, the other woman captured his interest. Taller than most women, he judged her to be, perhaps, only 4 inches shorter than himself. Her marmalade-coloured hair looked between butter and toast. She wore her hair severely pulled back, save for a few curls coaxed around her face in bare homage to the prevailing style. Her eyes were Mediterranean blue, clear and direct beneath fair, well-arched light brown brows that lent her a perpetual, surprised-by-life look. Her skin glowed, attesting to long hours outdoors. Against the warm, tan glow, a white, crescent-shaped scar on her chin stood out, but she didn't tuck her head down to minimize its effect as many women and men would have. She met the world with it straight on. Miles found himself fascinated. "Mrs. Hallowell, please forgive this intrusion," he began, addressing the taller woman. Anne's lips twitched. She looked down at Ursula. "See what I mean?" Ursula Hallowell looked up at Anne and nodded wryly. Then she stepped forward. "Your Grace, I am Mrs. Hallowell," she said. "Your pardon, madam," Miles said. He lifted her hand to bestow a chaste salute, and felt a sharp twinge of disappointment. Mrs. Hallowell shrugged prettily. "You are not the first. I doubt you shall be the last," she said with a laugh. She gestured toward Anne. "This is my stepdaughter, Miss Ann Hallowell." The Duke bowed. "I was just admiring your watercolour, Miss Hallowell. You have a nice sense of colour and subject." She glanced toward the painting, then laughed self-effacingly. "Ursula would insist on hanging it." "I like it," Mrs. Hallowell said flatly. Then she smiled broadly at the Duke. "Please, won't you sit down, Your Grace?" She led him to a cosy seating arrangement by the fireplace. Miss Hallowell, he noted, trailed quietly behind her, though he thought he detected the hint of amusement in her eyes. His eyes narrowed in curiosity at her slow, stately, and slightly off-balanced gait. However, his attention was soon claimed by Mrs. Hallowell, who smiled up at him, her manner flirtatious, but without, to his relief, any real interest. Mrs. Hallowell motioned her butler, who'd followed them into the room, to serve sherry, and then she sat in one of the blue, silk-covered chairs closest to the white marble fireplace. "My butler said you have a message for us from the Viscount Redinger. I trust he is still planning on attending the house party," she said, as she gestured her invitation for him to take the seat opposite her. "Regrettably, no," he replied, as he flicked up the tails of his coat and settled in the matching blue, silk-covered chair, while Miss Hallowell sat on a nearby small, blue and gold-striped sofa. "What?" Ursula demanded, half rising to her feet, then self-consciously sitting down again. She glanced at Anne, and Miles followed her lead. Miss Hallowell seemed to take amusement from his announcement, much to Mrs. Hallowell's consternation. "Not but that he wishes to, however." Miles hastened to add, as he looked from one woman to the other, curious as to the sudden undercurrents in the room. "It is just that he has met with a slight accident." "An accident? He is not dead, is he?" Mrs. Hallowell shrieked. No, calm yourself, madam. Nothing like that, I assure you. He's just... well..." Miles could feel warmth rise to his cheeks, and felt like a bloody schoolboy. Silent, he cursed Redinger for tasking him with this duty, and himself for agreeing. "Redinger will be laid up for a while." "What happened?" Miss Hallowell asked, leaning forward slightly. She looked interested despite herself. Curious. Miles stroked his chin with his knuckles. "I've always pondered what the correct response would be in these situations. I now realize there is none," he confessed, ruefully smiling. Though Mrs. Hallowell sat directly across from him, he found himself turning more and more to face Miss Hallowell. Anne Hallowell laughed delightedly, enjoying the Duke's rueful smile and everything else about the gentleman. His blue superfine coat, faced in black, showed a casual elegance. Only a single fob on a plain gold chain hung from his buff-coloured waistcoat, which matched his buff-coloured pantaloons. He lacked ostentation, but drew attention to himself with his calm, self-assured manner. His wavy, dusky brown hair had escaped the pomade pot and fell forward across his wide brow. But most of all, it was his eyes that drew her attention, for they were the golden-brown colour of the sherry Isley had poured into her glass. "Ah, the quandary of the truth versus the social lie," she managed to say lightly. "Exactly," he said, his warm sherry gaze holding hers. Breathless, Anne deliberately broke eye contact. "Oh, well, let's have the truth. I'm sure it's much more interesting." Faced with explaining Redinger's absence, Miles suddenly felt like a damn poacher. Anne Hallowell fascinated him as no woman had, and she was his cousin's intended. His jaw clenched as he leaned back in his chair. "That would depend on your point of view," he said more formally. Miss Hallowell cocked her head as she considered that. "Yes, I suppose that would be true." Redinger is not amused. She laughed again. "The victim seldom is. Out with it," she insisted, her deep blue eyes alight with mischief. "I gather," he said slowly, looking from one woman to the other. "He was rather well into his cups." Miss Hallowell nodded. "That goes without saying." He blinked in surprise at her calm acceptance, then felt a rush of anger that something in her past should lead her to consider a man's drunkenness commonplace. He took a steadying breath. "It seems," he said evenly, "that the matter began with an altercation between himself and a watchman who was crying out the hour and saying all was well. Redinger didn't feel well, so he took exception to the man's statements." "Boxing the watch," she stated, leaning back against a nest of gold brocade sofa pillows that highlighted the golden tones in her hair. Miles wished he'd brought his portfolio to this visit. He would have delighted in sketching Miss Hallowell. A sketch of her nestled against the sofa pillows would have contrasted his sketch of Redinger against another bank of pillows. "According to Redinger," he said slowly, "that was an accident. The box fell on him." Anne Hallowell clapped her hands together and laughed. "Oh, famous! That, to be sure, was an accident. I do so hope his injuries are not too severe," Mrs. Hallowell said, frowning slightly at her stepdaughter, condemning her amusement and too casual attitude. Miss Hallowell ignored her. "No, it is my belief he is using cracked ribs and a broken arm as a formal excuse, while bruises and scrapes on his face are more likely at fault," Miles said dryly. Anne looked toward Mrs. Hallowell. "See what I mean about flaws?" She touched the scar on her chin. "Still believe he won't cry craven?" Mrs. Hallowell looked chagrined. "But a man's vanity is a separate thing," she argued weakly. A frown drew Miles's dusky brown brows together. "I beg your pardon?" he asked.
"Oh, dear, I do apologize, Your Grace,"
Mrs. Hallowell said with a tittering laugh, her older woman manner at odds with her youthful appearance.
"So rude of us. I will confess my mind is in a dither. Ours has a higher purpose,"
she stated meaningfully. From the small sofa he heard a tiny spurt of laughter. Mrs. Hallowell quickly glanced in that direction, frowned, then continued.
"We have planned this party carefully, balanced the guest list, and overall done our utmost to ensure its success, and so to thereby convince the Dowager not to hide herself and her art away from appreciative eyes. Now our numbers shall be uneven. What shall we do?"
She wrung her hands together a moment, then suddenly clasped them tightly together and surged to her feet. Miles perforce rose as well.
"I have it!"
she exclaimed. Anne and Miles looked at her curiously.
"You shall come to Versley Park in Viscount Redinger's stead,"
Mrs. Hallowell exclaimed. "Me?" protested Miles.
"Him?"
protested Miss Hallowell. They looked at each other. Anne shrugged.
"Yes, it is the perfect solution,"
Mrs. Hallowell insisted. "Perfect solution?" Miles parroted, all at sea. Anne Hallowell laughed.
"Your course has been charted. Best you follow, for Ursula will not take no for an answer once she's in full sail with an idea. I know. I've been her victim on more than one occasion."
Mrs. Hallowell paced the room, ignoring them both.
"It is a perfect solution," she murmured. "Well, not perfect, perhaps. Perfect would be both attending. Under the circumstances, it is perfect. Then again, maybe in all circumstances. Better suited, I'd hazard. Yes."
"Mrs. Hallowell?" Miles tried. Anne chuckled.
"No use. She is plotting and planning."
He cocked his head, and his eyebrows rose in an expression that Anne began to see as his habit when he questioned another's statement. She owned it effective, for she found herself hurrying to explain.
"When Ursula is planning something, particularly someone's life, she is lost to everything around her. She babbles to herself as if she were having a conversation, arguing points back and forth. When she is done, she will simply tell us what we are to do."
"Is there no arguing against her?" Miles asked.
"Oh, no. Words are useless," she said, laughter dancing in her eyes. "It's best to go along with her as much as one can. Objections are better through actions than words." "Besides, you want to go and she'd want you,"
Mrs. Hallowell chimed in, only pausing a moment in her pacing.
"All that art? Did you know she has a Wingate?"
"No. Does she really?" Miles said with mild amusement. He hated to admit it, but she was correct. He did want to go to Versley Park. He had even felt a twinge of envy when Redinger mentioned it to him. But not at the behest of a scheming female, no matter what her plans. He'd had enough of those types in the days since he'd inherited the title. Then again, her interest seemed to be more toward encouraging the Dowager Duchess to entertain more. Getting the Dowager to share her art collection was a worthwhile task. Perhaps he could offer some small support with their endeavour. The lump of cold dread he'd felt in his stomach when she decreed he come in Redinger's place began to dissolve. He began to feel more in charity with Mrs. Hallowell.
"A Wingate!"
Anne exclaimed, chagrined. Ellinbourne! How could she have failed to connect his name? Wingate was one of her most favourite artists, one whose style she studied for her paintings. He'd complimented that schoolroom painting of hers, and she'd just dismissed his words. She put her hands against her suddenly burning cheeks and rose hurriedly to her feet.
"I beg your pardon, Your Grace. I didn't connect your name. And what you said of my painting—"
Anne knew she was babbling but couldn't stop. Like her grandmother, art was her passion. Now she understood why Ursula had been surprised when she didn't recognize the Duke of Ellinbourne's name. He smiled at her, and Anne felt a frisson of excitement trail down her spine. The thought ran through her head that she wished he were Redinger, for she could see marrying a man like him. Dismayed at her wayward thought, she dismissed it as quickly as it came. "I'm used to people not connecting my name with my title, though I'll admit I've often wished it could be otherwise," Miles said with a slight laugh. Anne's heart contracted painfully in her chest. She'd somehow wounded him, and that was the last thing she could possibly have wished to do. Was it because no one equated Ellinbourne with Wingate, a duke with an artist? "I have a present for you," he went on to say, banishing the twinge of bitterness she'd heard in his voice. "A sketch I did of Redinger that he bade me give to you."
"A sketch? How lovely! We must have it framed,"
Mrs. Hallowell said, this time not pausing in her pacing. Miles and Anne ignored her, each two caught up in their painful awareness of the other.
"A real Wingate sketch,"
Anne breathed, her eyes shining. He paused. "I'm sorry. I signed it Ellinbourne," he said stiffly. She shook her head. "What's the difference?" "To many, everything."
"Nonsense,"
she swiftly declared.
"It is the quality of the art, not the name upon it, that is important."
"A duke patronizes art," he said for the second time that day. "He does not create it."
"Talent is talent, and I think you know that you only want reassurance from others,"
she said shrewdly. Their eyes met and held each other's gaze. He shrugged finally, and a tiny smile pulled up the corner of his lips. An artist's self-worth is measured in the appreciation of his endeavors in the eyes of others. She considered his comment seriously.
"To an extent. But are all capable of judgment?"
"Ah, there is the rub. Here." He handed her the scroll and sketch. "Redinger asked me to give you this to prove his disability, not as a work of art. On the scroll is, evidently, a poem written by him. He assures me that all women are enamored with poetry written for them." Anne stared enraptured at the sketch, ignoring the scroll. She loved the picture. Not that it was of Redinger, who she supposed to be a bit of a spoiled youth, but because there was a wealth of emotion in the sketch, a wealth of unstated ideas, and because it was created by the man standing next to her. Her eyes glazed with unshed tears.
"Thank you,"
she choked out. Miles saw the welling tears in her eyes. To his surprise, they were like a knife thrust in his gut. Damn Redinger. He was a lucky gentleman. Anne laid a gentle hand on his arm.
"You will come to Versley Park, won't you?"
She knew that if he came, she would have someone she could talk to, and the pitying stares of the other guests would not bother her so. He looked down into her wide-open, deep blue eyes, and could not imagine saying no. "May I escort you, ladies?"
"Colonel Brantley, a friend of my stepmother's, is, but we should be glad of another's company. We leave at 9. Is that too early?"
He laughed. "I am up regularly at dawn. I find it a most peaceful time to create. 9 will be fine. But aren't you going to read Redinger's poem? I'll admit I am curious. It was not an aspect of my cousin I'd expected to discover."
"Yes, of course."
She untied the purple ribbon and broke the seal on the scroll. It was tightly rolled and did not open easily. Miles followed her as she crossed the room to lay the scroll out on the French-style writing desk so she could smooth it out. As she did so, her eyes scanned it.
"Oh, dear,"
she said faintly, her cheeks burning. "What is it?" She stood aside to let him read the poem.
"The Art of Love, by Sebastian Redinger, Viscount Redinger. Oh, blue-eyed dancing sprite of beauty, how you push and pull me from my duty! A golden spirit chasing night's dew, with milk-white hands fluttering afore you. You catch my heart and parts with your motions, till my mind doth whirl and lose all notions, and as lock doth joyfully meet the key, so my art doth strive to heed your plea."
Miles blanched. Then dark colour rose above his stock to stain his neck. Redinger said he wrote it for an opera dancer. Miles should have deduced the poem would have a sexual nature, but for it to describe a sexual encounter, and Redinger not remember the content was outrageous. His fist closed about the parchment, his knuckles white. "Redinger!" he ground out. Ursula stopped her pacing and turned to stare. Miles stood rigidly a moment, a muscle jumping in his lean cheek as he worked to conquer his anger and chagrin. When he felt the flush of colour and embarrassment fade, he turned to look at Miss Hallowell, standing so still beside him. Her complexion blanched white, her dark blue eyes wide with shock. If Redinger had been there, Miles would have happily throttled him. Then he saw something begin to displace the shock in her eyes. Ann Hallowell looked up at him. A mischievous smile turned up her lips and lit her eyes where only moments before shock had dwelt. He raised his hand to halt her words before she even thought to say them. "This is my office, and I shall take great pleasure in stuffing it down his throat." She laughed.
"At least it rhymed."